In the quiet aftermath of the Queen's passing, a final detail hidden deep within her private will shocked even the most seasoned royal insiders. It wasn't a title or a tiara, but a collection of her most personal, handwritten diaries. And the real twist? She left them to Prince Edward and Edward alone. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The Queen's will, long thought to be a formality of ceremonial tradition, became a thunderclap in the silence of mourning. Hidden in a sealed clause overlooked by even her most senior advisors was the instruction that a specific trunk containing her decades of personal diaries be given solely to her youngest son. No copies, no sharing, no discussion. To the monarchy's inner circle, this was not just unexpected, it was unthinkable. For decades, Prince Charles, now king, had believed it was he who would one day inherit the full breadth of his mother's written legacy. The transition of power had been prepared, rehearsed, and politically sculpted over years. But this was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. When the document was read privately at Windsor, a stunned silence followed the words, To Edward. Charles, seated with his aides, reportedly paused, unsure whether what he'd heard was correct. But it was. There were no ambiguities. The diaries spanning handwritten volumes going back as far as the Queen's early reign would pass entirely into Prince Edward's hands. Not to the new king, not to the royal archives. To Edward. And only Edward. The implications hit the palace like a wave. First came confusion. Had there been a legal error? A misstatement? Royal legal teams examined the wording again and again, but the clause was deliberate. Then came speculation. Why would the Queen, so precise, so symbolic in all her decisions, choose Edward? Advisors closest to her began whispering of a private bond between mother and son, a quiet trust that had deepened in her final years. Some believed Edward had long served as her emotional confidant, one who never courted the spotlight, nor publicly defied the institution. What made this revelation even more explosive was the mystery surrounding the content of the diaries themselves. These were not simply schedules or notes, they were believed to contain unfiltered reflections, inner doubts, and truths never spoken aloud, topics long buried, scandals carefully managed, relationships fractured and never repaired, all possibly laid bare in her own words. The media didn't know yet, but within the walls of Buckingham Palace, a storm had already begun brewing. Advisors debated whether Charles could issue a royal order to claim the diaries for the crown. Others warned that doing so could provoke a constitutional scandal. After all, these weren't state documents, they were personal, and the Queen's intentions were unmistakable. And then came the unspoken emotional weight. Charles, fresh into his reign, had to reconcile with the idea that his own mother had chosen to entrust her most sacred thoughts, not to him, but to the brother, who had always walked 2 steps behind. It was not merely a decision of estate, it was a decision of the heart. But if the inheritance was surprising, what Edward did next would turn the royal household upside down. As pressure mounted from inside the palace walls, Prince Edward made a choice that rattled the monarchy. He would not share the diaries, not with Charles, not with anyone. His silence wasn't just personal, it was political, and it reopened wounds the family had long tried to bury. The statement was brief, formal, and passed quietly through royal channels. It bore Edward's seal and a message that stunned even those closest to the crown. The Queen entrusted these writings to me. I intend to honor her wishes. They will remain private. There were no press conferences, no elaboration, but the silence spoke volumes. For a man long seen as reserved, loyal, and deferential, this was an act of quiet defiance. Behind closed doors, the reaction was immediate. Charles, blindsided and still reeling from the Queen's decision, saw the statement as a direct challenge not just to his authority as monarch, but to his role as guardian of the royal legacy. He is said to have expressed his frustration in private, calling the move needlessly divisive and urging aides to find a diplomatic resolution. Queen Camilla reportedly sided with her husband, interpreting Edward's stance as a betrayal of royal unity. Her advisors, ever cautious of optics, warned that the narrative could spiral, painting a picture of a fractured family feuding over their matriarch's memory. But Edward would not budge, and that resistance stirred something deeper. Among staff who had served the Queen for decades, Edward's resolve wasn't arrogance, it was duty. They remembered his quiet devotion, his calm presence during crises, his lack of ambition for titles. If anyone understood the gravity of the Queen's inner world, it was him. And yet, his choice reopened long-dormant rivalries. As children, Edward and Charles had never been close. The age gap, the responsibilities, the expectations, all had built distance. And now, that old chasm widened. The king, now surrounded by formality, looked at a brother acting from feeling, not protocol. A brother who, in withholding the Queen's thoughts, might be protecting more than just her wishes, perhaps even shielding truths that could destabilize the monarchy's carefully maintained image. The palace attempted damage control. Aides downplayed the tension. Official statements were vague, referring to a family matter being handled with sensitivity. But behind the scenes, the struggle was intensifying. What was in those diaries? Names? Scandals? Regrets? And why had Edward chosen silence over transparency? The press hadn't gotten hold of the full story yet. But leaks were beginning. Whispers in corridors. Prying questions at royal events. The storm was coming. As whispers turned into headlines, the palace scrambled to maintain control, but the press was already circling. The leak was inevitable. Someone inside let it slip. Queen Elizabeth had left behind diaries, and Edward was refusing to share them. Within hours, the British press ignited, speculating on everything from buried royal affairs to secret succession plans. And the palace? Utterly unprepared. It began with a whisper in the newsroom of a mid-tier tabloid. Within minutes, that whisper was a headline. The Queen's secret diaries, Edward refuses to comply. From there, it spread like wildfire. Every major paper ran with it, each story more sensational than the last. "Windsor bombshell," screamed one. "What is Prince Edward hiding?" asked another. As television networks mobilized round-the-clock panels and scrolling tickers, the royal household was blindsided. This wasn't just media noise, it was a full-blown crisis. Former palace staffers were dragged into the spotlight, pushed for sound bites. Royal biographers, many with axes to grind, theorized about what those pages might contain. Illicit affairs, backroom power plays, explosive opinions on political leaders. No theory was too wild, no speculation too outlandish. Suddenly, Edward wasn't just the quiet royal, he was the gatekeeper to a potential reckoning. On social media, hashtags surged. Diaries of the Queen trended globally. Memes, speculation, threads, amateur handwriting analysts all demanding answers. What began as an internal family rift had now become a public spectacle. At Charles's next royal engagement, the questions came before the car door even opened. "Your Majesty, what's in the diaries?" shouted one reporter. "Do you believe Edward is protecting your mother's legacy or hiding something?" The king's face tightened. He said nothing, but his silence only deepened the media's hunger. Kensington Palace was forced to act. A statement was released, but it said little. Carefully worded, it referred to a personal inheritance of the late Queen, currently being handled with private discretion, but no denial, no confirmation, no clarity. And that vacuum of truth allowed the narrative to spin further out of control. Inside the palace, the PR machine moved into overdrive. Emergency strategy meetings were called. Media advisors begged the family to present a united front. But there was no unity to be found. The monarchy had been caught off guard, and now it was bleeding public trust. Every appearance, every speech, every silence was picked apart. The royal family wasn't just fighting rumors anymore, they were fighting a narrative that was writing itself faster than they could control. Because once the press had its teeth in a story like this, it didn't let go. Not until someone bled. And in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, They knew one thing for certain: containment had failed. But the real damage wasn't just external inside the monarchy. A quiet war had begun. Behind closed doors, two brothers once united in grief now stood oceans apart. For Charles, it was a matter of duty. For Edward, it was about legacy. The Queen had made her choice, and for the first time in decades, Edward refused to back down. The atmosphere inside the palace had grown cold, brittle. What began as a quiet disagreement over privacy had escalated into an outright confrontation. Details of private arguments, meant to remain within the walls of Windsor, began to seep into the press. Sources close to the family revealed a storm of tension between the king and his youngest brother, described by one insider as years of silence and deference erupting in a matter of days. Charles, always the heir and now the sovereign, reportedly viewed Edward's refusal as more than stubbornness. To him, it was a direct challenge to his authority, a disruption of protocol, a crack in the chain of command he had spent a lifetime preparing to uphold. And worse, it was public. But Edward wasn't interested in protocol. Not this time. He made it clear, privately and through his carefully worded refusals, that the Queen had made a deeply personal decision, one he intended to honour. The diaries, he argued, were not state property. They were not official. They were his mother's final act of trust, and he would not betray that trust, not even for the king. He wasn't just protecting her words, he was protecting the bond they shared, one rarely spoken of, but fiercely guarded. And for once, Edward chose not to retreat into silence. This standoff did more than raise eyebrows. It peeled back decades of quiet royal dynamics. Charles, burdened from birth with the weight of expectation, had often been accused of emotional distance, even by those closest to him. Edward, by contrast, had been seen as dutiful, obliging, the one who never asked for more than he was given. But behind the public smiles were years of swallowed pride and hidden resentment. Now, with the Queen gone, those emotions had found their voice. Their arguments were said to be intense, laced with a history that stretched all the way back to boyhood. Charles's fury, Edward's calm defiance, neither willing to yield. Princess Anne, ever the pragmatist, reportedly stepped in, privately pleading with both brothers to consider the long-term cost. Her message was simple but piercing. Once fractured, the monarchy's internal unity may never fully heal. But her words, it seems, fell on deaf ears. By the time Easter approached, Charles and Edward were no longer speaking directly. Every message passed through aides. Every glance at public engagements was studied for tension. It was the most significant rupture in their relationship since the chaos that followed Princess Diana's death. And yet, amid the growing rift, a far more destabilizing truth was looming, one buried not in speculation, but in ink. Because yet while the brothers clashed, one detail in the Queen's diaries would soon send shockwaves through the monarchy. One leaked passage changed everything. It referenced Princess Diana not from Charles's perspective, but from the Queen's. And it wasn't what the world expected. Suddenly, the public saw a monarch not detached from the tragedy but haunted by it. The excerpt appeared without warning, delivered to a single newsroom by an anonymous source who claimed first-hand access. No provenance, no explanation. Just a photograph of a page-aged paper, unmistakable handwriting, and a line that detonated across the world within minutes. I failed her. I failed them both. The words were attributed to the Queen herself, written in the months following Diana's death. The effect was seismic. For decades, the monarchy had been portrayed as stoic, controlled, emotionally distant from the storm that consumed the late princess. This single sentence shattered that narrative. It suggested regret, responsibility, a private reckoning that had never been shared. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Old wounds reopened, vigils formed again outside palace gates. Commentators who once criticized the Queen now spoke of quiet compassion. For some, the passage was a balm proof that Diana's pain had not gone unnoticed at the highest level. For others, it reignited anger, a reminder that remorse does not undo damage. The country mourned all over again, this time not just for Diana, but for a family trapped by duty and silence. Inside the palace, shock turned to panic. Charles was reportedly blindsided, struggling to process whether this line so personal, so devastating, was truly his mother's final word on the most painful chapter of his life. If authentic, it reframed everything. His marriage, his choices, the years of public judgment. It wasn't just history being rewritten, it was legacy being recast. And there was no easy response. Denying the passage risked appearing defensive. Acknowledging it risked validating a narrative he had spent decades trying to move beyond. Camilla, too, felt the ground shift beneath her. The passage didn't mention her by name, but the implications were unavoidable. Commentators re-examined her role, questioning how the Queen truly felt during those turbulent years. Old debates resurfaced with new intensity. Had forgiveness been granted, or merely extended in public? The silence from the palace only deepened the speculation, allowing the story to metastasize across headlines and timelines. And then the questions turned to Edward. If the diaries were in his possession, how had this page escaped? Was the leak a betrayal of his promise to protect the Queen's wishes, or something else entirely? Some insiders whispered it was a warning, a reminder of what could happen if pressure continued. Others believed Edward had been blindsided himself, a victim of someone testing the limits of secrecy. Either way, the damage was done. The diaries were no longer just private writings, they were live ammunition in a war of memory and meaning. As the nation reeled, one truth became unavoidable. The Queen's inner world was far more complex than anyone had been allowed to see. Her regrets were real, her pain deeply buried. And if this was only one passage, what else lay hidden in those pages? But if the Queen had regrets, she also had plans, and her final entries hinted at a vision the monarchy wasn't ready to face. Buried in the final pages of the Queen's diaries was a startling truth: she had envisioned a softer, more human monarchy. A monarchy not ruled solely by blood, but by emotional intelligence and empathy. And the implications were enormous. In elegant but unflinching prose, Queen Elizabeth laid bare her fears for the future of the monarchy. She spoke not of crowns or bloodlines, but of compassion, connection, and emotional awareness. She wrote of traditions that, though once necessary, had calcified into constraints. The institution, she warned, was teetering at the edge of relevance not because of public scandal or modern politics, but because it had lost its humanity. It had become performative, mechanical, and dangerously cold. The Queen, the very emblem of that tradition, was now urging its reinvention, and at the center of her quiet revolution was a figure few had ever expected to lead such a charge: her youngest son, Prince Edward. The Queen praised his quiet constancy, his measured words, and his aversion to spectacle. He had, she noted, always chosen service over spotlight. While others pursued legacy through grandeur, Edward built trust through humility. She described him as the safest steward of continuity, someone unburdened by the need to command, yet fully capable of guiding. In a striking passage, she acknowledged that his restraint, long dismissed by the press, was in fact the very trait the monarchy would one day require most. But the diaries didn't stop there. They included unsettling critiques of the institution's coldness in the face of crisis, particularly during moments of personal tragedy. There were gentle warnings, even toward Charles. Though never unkind, her words were sobering. She worried that his reign, if shaped solely by protocol and entitlement, could isolate rather than inspire. William, too, appeared in her reflections, positioned as a bridge to the future, but not immune to the trappings of inherited power. And then came two names that caught even seasoned observers off guard: Louis and Charlotte. The Queen described them as hope for a gentler crown. It was more than sentiment. It was a clear, almost prophetic belief that the future of the monarchy could lie not in who shouted loudest from the balcony, but in those who listened the closest from the wings. She saw in them something unspoiled, something that might escape the machinery that had consumed generations before them. Within the palace, the revelations hit like a thunderclap. Charles reportedly interpreted the entries as a veiled critique, an indirect challenge to his vision of kingship. William, usually calm, was said to be deeply disturbed, not by what was written, but by what it implied. That the Queen's heart may have aligned more closely with a future that did not center them. As the public absorbed these revelations, a powerful question took root. Had the Queen, in her final reflections, anointed Edward not as heir, but as her moral successor? A steward of spirit rather than crown? The debate wasn't just hypothetical, it was existential, because if the monarchy was to survive the 21st century, it would have to choose, continue on its current path, or heed the vision of its longest reigning sovereign. As the Queen's vision came to light, pressure mounted, and Charles was about to make a move no one expected. Charles had stayed quiet long enough. Now, in a private meeting, he issued a royal ultimatum: return the diaries or face consequences. For Edward, the choice wasn't just about papers. It was about loyalty to the crown or to the Queen herself. Inside the austere walls of Balmoral, a storm had been gathering. What began as quiet disapproval had now hardened into a command. Charles summoned Edward not with warmth, but with formality. There were no pleasantries, no pretense. The monarch had made his decision. The Queen's diaries, now infamous and dangerously symbolic, had to be returned to the crown. His words were clear. For the preservation of the monarchy, they cannot remain in your possession. Edward, seated across from the brother he had supported through decades of royal chaos, looked him squarely in the eye and refused. His voice, measured but firm, delivered a blow that no crown could shield. They were hers, and she left them to me, not the institution. I will honor her wishes, not rewrite them. The silence that followed was heavy. Charles's tone shifted, no longer asking, now warning. What Edward was doing, he argued, was jeopardizing stability, giving fuel to tabloids, inviting scandal into the heart of the monarchy. But Edward didn't flinch. His refusal wasn't rebellion, it was reverence. And that only deepened the sting. The confrontation turned sharp accusations whispered, old grievances reignited. The conversation cracked under years of buried tension, and suddenly it was no longer just about the diaries. It was about legacy, favoritism, and the silent wounds left unhealed by duty. As the confrontation ended without resolution, Charles contacted William and Anne. A family meeting was hastily arranged, but it solved nothing. Anne, ever the pragmatist, urged restraint. William, caught between loyalty to his father and growing empathy for Edward's integrity, said little. No consensus, no compromise, just deadlock. And as word quietly leaked of the failed summit, rumors exploded. Some suggested Charles was preparing legal pathways to seize the diaries. Others whispered of a looming constitutional crisis. But beneath the noise was a more dangerous truth. The royal family, already strained, was now fractured at its core. Behind palace gates, aides scrambled to keep appearances intact, but inside the monarchy, lines had been drawn. Edward, once the quiet one, had become the unexpected resistor. Charles, ascending after a lifetime of waiting, now faced a rebellion not from politicians or public opinion, but from within his own bloodline. And the stakes were rising. Because the diaries no longer represented pages, they were a symbol of control, of memory, of truth. But as the crown flexed its power, the public delivered its own verdict, and it didn't side with the king. Polls shifted. Support flooded in, not for Charles, but for Edward. The public didn't want another royal cover-up. They wanted truth, and for the first time in years, one of the Queen's children stood on principle against the throne itself. Within days of the confrontation leaking to the press, the tide had turned. Public sentiment was no longer a quiet hum, it had become a roar. Social media ignited, with hashtags like #Let Edward Keep Them and #Queen Canoe Best trending across platforms. Thousands voiced what many inside the palace had feared: Edward wasn't being disobedient, he was being honest. In the face of royal control and historic silence, The youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II was emerging as an unlikely guardian of integrity, and for a nation that had witnessed decades of secrets buried beneath palatial walls, this rare defiance felt like redemption. Opinion columns praised Edward's poise, his restraint, and above all, his refusal to fold under pressure. Editorials once focused on Charles's reign now asked tougher questions. Why silence these diaries? What was the monarchy hiding? For a public weary of managed appearances and damage control, Edward's position resonated. He wasn't seeking power, he was protecting memory. Meanwhile, advisors to the king scrambled to contain the fallout. The suggestion was simple: back down. Let the matter fade before it further fractures the institution. But pride, long buried beneath decades of waiting, now defined Charles's every move. He couldn't and wouldn't yield. And then, unexpectedly, William intervened. Quietly, privately. Without cameras or courtiers, he reached out to Edward. No speeches, no conditions. Just a conversation between two sons of the same queen, both trying to navigate what she had left behind. It wasn't an endorsement, but it wasn't condemnation either. It was understanding, and it sent ripples through the family. Perhaps the divide wasn't generational, perhaps it was emotional. Then came the moment that changed everything. In a rare public appearance, Edward broke his silence. His voice, steady but heavy with emotion, delivered a single sentence that echoed across the nation. Some memories belong to the heart, not the throne. It was a simple truth, but a profound indictment. Against the machinery of royal control, against the demand to turn every legacy into propaganda. It was, in many ways, a son speaking on behalf of a mother who could no longer defend her own words. Cameras captured applause. Journalists for once held silence, and in that silence, the nation listened. Because while Edward didn't expose the diaries, he revealed something far more powerful: the humanity behind them. Not as scandal, but as remembrance, as love. And yet, the final twist wasn't about legacy or power, but about the Queen's last request, still hidden in the pages no one had read. In the final page of her final diary, Queen Elizabeth wrote a message, not to the monarchy, but to her children. A message about forgiveness, love, and the burdens of duty. And in those closing lines, everything changed. After weeks of unrest, Edward sat alone with the diaries in a room thick with silence. Flipping through the pages not yet shared, his fingers stopped at one bound in gold thread, a sealed envelope tucked into the back cover. It bore no official crest, no formality, only 5 handwritten words: "For my sons read alone." His heart pounded as he opened it, knowing this wasn't for history, nor for headlines. It was a mother's parting wish. Inside, the Queen had written not as a sovereign, but as a mother torn by time, tradition, and regret. She confessed that the pressures of duty had made her distant, that love too often gave way to protocol. But most powerfully, she warned of the price of pride. "Bitterness is the quiet destroyer," she wrote. "Do not let it claim what I could not save." She named no names, she blamed no one, but her words hit with piercing clarity. "I chose you not to divide the family, but to protect it from itself." And in that line, everything reframed. The inheritance of her diaries wasn't an act of favoritism, it was an act of desperation. Her final attempt to preserve the truth, while sparing the monarchy from collapse. Edward read the letter again, slower this time. Then he placed it back where it belonged, not in a vault, but beside him, near his heart. And for the first time since the chaos began, he made his decision not out of defiance, but out of love. He would share selected passages from the diaries, not to shame the crown, not to settle scores, but to heal. He released a statement, brief but profound. "Some truths are meant to unite, not divide. I share these not as a prince, but as her son." The reaction was immediate. Headlines softened, the palace exhaled. Charles, upon hearing the letter's contents, reportedly wept in private. It was the Queen's voice, not commanding, but vulnerable, that finally broke the silence between brothers. No public handshake followed, no grand reconciliation staged for cameras. But behind the scenes, Charles stepped back. Not in defeat, but in quiet acknowledgement. The battle for the Diaries had never been about power. It had always been about grief, and now, that grief had finally found release. Edward kept the rest of the Diaries sealed, not because he wanted to guard secrets, but because some truths belong not to the public, but to those who lived them. The monarchy moved on, a little more fractured, but also a little more human. And as time passed, the Queen's final act of honesty stood not as scandal, but as legacy. And so, the Queen's voice lived on, not in speeches, nor ceremonies, but in ink, in memory, and in the silence of the one son she trusted to keep her truth. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.